It is July 1st, 1862. McClellan and Robert E. Lee have met several times throughout this Peninsula campaign, with one of the most recent being Gaines' Mill, where Robert E. Lee attacked with 55 or so thousand troops, almost his entire army, to overwhelm the Union forces at Gaines' Mill. McClellan has now decided to retreat back to the James River and to ultimately bring his forces back so they can pretty much save what's left of this Peninsula campaign that he has so brought on here in Virginia outside of Richmond. But on July 1st, around 1 p.m., the artillery's divisions of each army are going to have a duel, and then Confederate troops are going to attack, and there's going to be a good amount of bloodshed. And that's where we are today for the Battle of Malvern Hill. Now, for me, as I walk this battlefield, it's quiet. Birds are flying to hunt their prey in the distance. It's not as breezy as I'd suppose it would be, and just nature is happening. But 163 years ago, these fields would be booming with cannon and small arms fire, and brave men would be killed. I've been to places, Gettysburg, Monocacy, they all have their bit of history as you walk the battlefield, of those hallowed grounds that these brave men once fought and died at. Malvern Hill and Gaines' Mill are my first 7 days campaigns, or 7 days battle Peninsula campaign battlefields. And I only got into them because of, well, mainly one is Civil War, two, if you've never read the Mexico City campaign, or at least heard about it, read about it, McClellan was trying to kind of redo that, revive it, emulate that campaign where his predecessor Winfield Scott, he led the U.S. Army from Veracruz to Mexico City in the course of a couple months. And McClellan was part of that army, and he served under Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott was he had a reputation about him, but nevertheless, he got the job done. McClellan would have a grand total roughly of 130,000 men on this Peninsula campaign. He'd fight at Yorktown. He'd have his men fight at Seven Pines and, Chrysler's Farm and Gaines' Mill, and have the Navy go all the way up the James River and bombard the heck out of Drury's Bluff. With some success, especially in the beginning of the campaign, McClellan had a very high sense of pride. He was very confident in this campaign from the get-go. But as time would come on, he would not only have to face Joe Johnston in the beginning, but then he'd end up facing Robert E. Lee. And he would have to kind of regroup his thoughts, his tactics and everything of how to get the job done. And then up to this point, he was also name blaming up in Washington. McClellan was loved by his soldiers, but he wasn't loved by his political allies and even his adversaries. The only one that really had his patience with McClellan was President Lincoln, especially when you read about it. I got today, The Peninsula Campaign, 1862, by Joseph P. Cullen. McClellan and Lee struggle for Richmond. And this book here has some pretty good insight of what happened with McClellan and Robert E. Lee when they both took over the armies. McClellan's chats, his messages between his wife and his leader, President Lincoln, and his commander-in-chief. But for the most part, everything led up to Malvern Hill right here. And that's the story I want to bring to you today. So I have with me Battle Maps of the Civil War, the Eastern Theater by the American Battlefield Trust. And here's what they have to say about Malvern Hill. On the late afternoon of June 30th, the retreating Federal Army of the Potomac finally stopped at the James River. Now, within the supporting range of the U.S. Navy gunboats, the bulk of McClellan's army took up a defensive position atop Malvern Hill. The 130-foot-high Malvern Hill offered some of the best defensive terrain of the entire Civil War. The plateau-like hill was flanked to the east by the ironically named Western Run, while to the west, Crew's Run and the Malvern Bluffs offered natural defensive barriers. Directly to the south lay the James River. To the north, gently rolling ground offered clear fields of fire with few ravines or defilades for the enemy to utilize on the attack. Colonel Henry J. Hunt, McClellan's chief of artillery, posted 171 guns facing west, north, and east on the hill. Federal infantry of the 5th, 3rd, and 4th Corps was in close support of the guns, with more infantry reserves nearby. Union gunboats prowled the James River well within close supporting distance. Robert E. Lee yearned to apply pressure to the enemy forces and destroy them against the James River. It was not to be. Poor maps, poor communication, confusing road names, another overly complicated battle plan, and another lackluster showing by Stonewall Jackson all worked in concert to doom the Confederate assault before it could get off the ground. The Confederates sought to counter the massed Federal artillery and soften the Union infantry with grand batteries of their own. Around 1 p.m., both sides opened an artillery duel, but poor coordination and an effective Union counter-battery fire doomed Lee's gunners. Lee next ordered in the infantry. In the course of a few hours, some 20 separate brigades under 7 division commanders clashed with the Federals. The attacks were not coordinated properly and advanced across the open ground at different times. Most were stalled well short of the hill's crest. For each Confederate advance, the effectiveness of the Federal artillery was the deciding factor. repulsing attack after attack, resulting in a tactical Union victory. Confederate General D.H. Hill surveyed the carnage on the bloody field and remarked after the war disgustedly, "It was not war, it was murder." On July 2nd, McClellan withdrew the army to Harrison's Landing on the James River, ending the 7 days battles and the first Union drive on Richmond. It would take almost 2 more years and cost tens of thousands of lives before the Federals were this close to Richmond again. Following the campaign, McClellan commenced a 6-week period of recovery and rehabilitation for his army. In the meantime, Lee pressed his newly won advantage and carried the war from central into northern Virginia and beyond. The high casualties and lessons learned at Malvern Hill and the 7 days battles raised both the military and political stakes of the war in profound ways. What's crazy is that once the Peninsula campaign is officially over and Lee decides to go north, this is when we see him go to Antietam, try to bring the war out of Virginia for the first time and bring the war to the north, because everyone's still expecting it to end soon. But Lee has his plans to go north, and McClellan is forced to follow him. Now, wherever Lee goes, McClellan must follow behind at this point, and is ordered by Lincoln for him to do so. Well, we all know after Antietam, McClellan gets relieved of command, and Burnside takes over pretty much. And then we see Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and then the whole 1863 battles and campaigns happen. You know, General Orders, 191? They're found in Frederick, right near Monocacy Battlefield. That's going to see fighting in a couple years after that. So, yeah. And right now I am at the Confederate artillery spot, where, if you can see right here, was that farmhouse, and the visitor spot is over here on my camera. It's pretty far away, but this battle has given in the first term of "it was not war, it was murder." We see that at Cold Harbor, written by General Law after he sees the carnage of the Union. So this was, I guess, the Confederates' first time of murder. So, and it's done through piecemeal, a strategy that does not work when you're attacking cannon and artillery. You have to attack in full force, which is the necessary thing to do. Most historians and professionals and more intelligent people than I will say. So, let's get on with it. Now, I must say, it is probably one of the hottest days right now in June as I'm doing this. It is 10 o'clock in the morning pretty much, and I'm sweating. I usually don't sweat, but I can only imagine what it was like for the men who had to charge and even be at their guns with all that smoke and the heat and the fire happening all around them. So here I have nothing to complain about, because I can just walk this and stroll this freely. But I do want to take a minute to talk about the terrain here. I've been to Monocacy, Gettysburg, all that other stuff. And it is true what they say that terrain does play a key role in how battles are fought. And I'm looking at the Union artillery position right now, walking from the Confederate artillery position. And the terrain is gradual, and it dips and dives in and goes, into the ground a little bit more, or at least dives down a little bit deeper in some areas. And I could see that with my own eyes. I don't think cameras can do it much justice. This is something that you would have to see whenever or if you visit. But like I say, I've done this battlefield pretty well so far. This is coming from a guy who lives in South Jersey. And it's a little bit cooler up there. So, with that being said, if you've ever been to Antietam, it kind of reminds me of the hills at Antietam, or even some of the hills at Monocacy, where the terrain really changes up real quick. In some cases, it's almost the opposite, where it's almost gradual. So, I can see how men could get bogged down and fight, but not be able to do much once they get to a certain point because they're just getting fired upon. So that's my take on that. I have with me here the Peninsula Campaign of 1862 by Joseph P. Cullen. McClellan and Lee struggle for Richmond. On page 145 it says, despite the complications and confusion, all were in position shortly after noon, with all the roads well protected and guarded. There were 2 weak spots in the line, however, that could mean trouble, depending, of course, on where the Confederates put the most pressure. Slocum and McCall's divisions had both lost over 2,000 men each in the past few days. If either one gave way, the situation could become rather ticklish, as McCall had more or less of an independent command, not being attached to any corps at that point. And while Slocum belonged to Franklin's corps, Franklin himself was back at White Oak Swamp with his other division, Smith and Richardson's division of Sumner's corps, and Sumner was at Glendale with Sedgwick's division. Who was responsible for what and to whom? A command set up like that, with not even a staff officer from Army headquarters on the field, was an open invitation for disaster. Although Grapevine Bridge had finally been repaired the night of the 29th, Jackson did not succeed in crossing all his command until the following morning, and did not reach White Oak Swamp in full force until noon, 2 hours after the Federals had burned the bridge. Under cover of the heavily wooded area, Jackson put 26 guns from Hill's division and 5 from Whiting's on a bluff to the right of the road, and about 2 o'clock opened with a terrifying roar on Richardson's division on the other side of the swamp. The fire was so sudden and unexpected that some of the Federal teamsters were caught at the edge of the swamp watering the mules. The bursting shells panicked the animals, and as one soldier remembered, they ran through Meagher's brigade and disabled more men than were injured by the enemy's artillery. Meanwhile, Longstreet and A.P. Hill, who had marched about 14 miles over unobstructed roads on the 29th and encamped that night at the junction of the Darbytown and Long Bridge roads, advanced down the Long Bridge road and ran into McCall's pickets about noon. After driving them in and discovering the Federals were in position and strength, Longstreet halted to put his division in line for a fight. Pryor's, Featherstone's, and Wilcox's brigades went to the left of the road, opposite McCall's right and Kearny's left, and Pickett's, Anderson's, and Kemper's brigades to the right, opposite McCall's left and Hooker's right. Branch's brigade was ordered up to support Kemper on the right, but the rest of Hill's division was held in the rear in reserve until late in the battle. Longstreet then waited for a signal from Huger, supposed to be coming down the Charles City Road, to begin the attack, And here he was, joined by Lee and Jefferson Davis on the field as usual. And about this time, Lee learned that the force under Holmes on the New Market Road below Malvern Hill had been stopped by a devastating artillery fire from the hill and the gunboats on the James. Earlier, Lee had observed what he believed to be indications of confusion in the Federal retreat at that point and had ordered Holmes to advance. What Lee had actually seen, however, was merely the last of the wagons and reserve artillery disappearing over Malvern Hill under the protection of Porter's 5th Corps. And when Holmes tried to advance, Porter massed guns on the hill opened on him, and Warren's brigade of Sykes' division was sent to block his advance on the road. Lee then ordered Magruder, who was coming down the Darbytown road, to Holmes' support, but Magruder floundered around on different roads until it was dark, so Holmes withdrew. When the sound of Jackson's artillery at Oak Swamp reached Longstreet sometime after 2 o'clock, he thought it was Huger advancing on the Charles City Road and hitting the Federal right flank. Immediately, he ordered his guns to open up in division to attack. Then complete confusion seemed to take the ground over which they were ordered to advance. In the swamps, woods, and ravines, alignments were broken and reformed again and again. Regiments lost contact with each other on the flanks, and the advance degenerated into a series of partial attacks at different times and places. The left of the line started the attack about 4 p.m., but it was after 5 p.m. before the regiments were on the right advance. There was little coordination among the brigades, and the staff work at divisional headquarters left much to be desired. Longstreet stated in his report, owing to the nature of the ground, that concert of action so essential to complete success could not obtain, particularly attacking such odds against us and in position. But the fighting nevertheless was vicious, most of it being close hand-to-hand. Regimental actions where club muskets and bayonets were freely used. Federal batteries with which McCall had placed in front of his infantry were taken and retaken, and then taken again. The attack on the left hit Meade's brigade and Reynolds' old brigade on McCall's right, and developed into an isolated fight over possession of Randall's battery of 12-pound Napoleons. One section of the battery was captured by the 11th Alabama of Wilcox's brigade when the 4th Pennsylvania gave way under the pressure. The Alabamians had suffered fearful losses, however, and when Lieutenant Randall managed to rally a few companies of the Pennsylvanians, he quickly recaptured his guns, only to have the 55th and 60th Virginia of Field's brigade, Hill's division, come up and retake them. The 9th and 10th Alabama captured another section of the ill-fated battery south of the road. Randall lost 6 guns altogether before the bloody day closed. General Meade was seriously wounded, and Colonel Simmons, in the temporary command of Reynolds' brigade, was killed, but the line held. In McCall's front, however, the fighting continued until dark, with 2 brigade commanders and most of his personal staff out of action. McCall was kept busy trying to keep control of his division and at the same time find reinforcements. Kearny eventually sent him 2 regiments, and Heselman persuaded Slocum to send Taylor's New Jersey brigade over to support the center of the Federal line. Just as darkness fell, McCall rode forward on the Long Bridge Road to ascertain the position of the 4th Pennsylvania, supposed to be in that area, and rode right into the 47th Virginia and was taken prisoner. The battle was over. As far as Lee was concerned, of course, it was another military zero similar to Beaver Dam. Nothing had been accomplished, but the possibilities had looked good. With 3 columns converging on the moving Federal army, Jackson in the rear, Huger on the flank, and Longstreet near the front, it had seemed as if something should have been accomplished. But the trouble was the tactics required for the successful completion of this strategy were much too complicated for this early period of the war. To begin with, Lee had been 24 hours late putting his divisions in motion, which further complicated things from the start. The country through which they were maneuvering, heavily wooded with numerous streams and swamps, ravines, gullies, and narrow, twisting country roads, combined with the lack of adequate maps, gave the advantage to the pursued, not the pursuers. The ignorance of the topography led the Confederates to underestimate the effectiveness of blocking roads and fords and destroying bridges. Offsetting these disadvantages required sound tactics, close cooperation between the divisional commanders involved, and excellent staff work at Army headquarters. Lee had none of these. If Huger and Jackson, for example, could have cooperated on both sides of White Oak Swamp at Brackett's Ford, it might have made a big difference in the outcome of this particular battle. Also, if Lee had sent Magruder, who had wasted the whole day in a senseless march from Savage Station to Darbytown Road, from Savage Station down the road to Brackett's Ford on the north side of the swamp, with Jackson on his left at the main crossing and Huger on his right on the south side of the swamp at the ford, and if they acted in concert under directions from Lee's headquarters and attacked aggressively at the same time, the Federal Army could have been in serious trouble. Jackson's complete inertia, of course, will probably always remain a mystery. The main criticism is not that he didn't force a crossing of the swamp, but he didn't even try. It would not have been an easy in any event, and without the active cooperation of Huger or some other division, probably impossible. After all, there were two good divisions that, with mass artillery under Franklin's command, contesting the crossing, and the roads and fords had been effectively blocked. The weak point, of course, was Brackett's Ford, just a mile above Jackson's position at White Oak Ridge, but he didn't even make a reconnaissance in that direction, nor did any staff officer come from Lee's headquarters to find out what the trouble was or to urge an immediate advance, and neither Huger nor Jackson thought it necessary to inform the general commanding of their situation and position at any time. In his report, Jackson stated a heavy cannonading in front announced the engagement of General Longstreet at Fraser's farm and made me eager to press forward. But the marshy character of the soil, the destruction of the bridge over the marsh and creek, and strong position of the enemy for defending the passage prevented my advancing until following morning. For the Federals, it had been a victory in a sense, as a serious threat to their rear that had been thwarted, and the most dangerous obstacle in their march had been overcome successfully. It probably would not have been disastrous, however, even if part of the line had been overwhelmed. The reserve artillery and almost all of the wagon train was already safely behind Malvern Hill when the battle commenced, and Porter had his corps and Keyes in position on the hill to defend it. The rest of the army could have rallied behind the hill. McClellan can hardly be credited with the victory, however, as he wasn't even on the field, although he had placed some of the divisions earlier. McCall reported of the 4 divisions that day engaged, each maneuvered and fought independently. And yet, Heintzelman and Sumner deserve some of the credit, for even though neither of them was actually in command of the field, or on the field, they both acted promptly and judiciously to get reinforcements when needed to various sectors of the line, a delicate problem considering the command setup under which they were working. And towards the close of the battle, Franklin had cooperated by sending Caldwell's and Meagher's brigades of Richardson's division when Sumner requested. Lee was not happy with the way the battle was conducted. It seems that sometime after 3 o'clock, realizing that his artillery could not be concentrated in any one spot in order to blast a hole in the Federal line, he was thinking of abandoning Longstreet's idea and possibly using A.P. Hill and Longstreet's troops to follow Jackson's suggestion of an attack on the Federal right. But it was already too late, and the orders could not be changed in time to stop D.H. Hill or Magruder from attacking. An attack on the Federal right probably would not have been any more successful anyway. Although the terrain would have been easier on an attacking force, Sumner and Franklin were both in position there, backed by plenty of reserve artillery, and by the time Lee could have made the move, it would have been dusk. In his report, Lee stated, "The obstacles presented by the woods and swamp made it impracticable to bring up a sufficient amount of artillery to oppose successfully the extraordinary force of that arm employed by the army. And while the field itself afforded us few positions favorable for its use and none for its proper concentration." Porter, of course, was well satisfied with the day's results. Although there had been little movement or guidance during the battle, with the exception of a few regiments, the brigades and brigades of some siege artillery, the position selected and the disposition of troops and artillery were certainly a credit to the officers involved. And now Porter suggested to McClellan that they hold this powerful position, even if they didn't advance on Richmond. McClellan, on board a gunboat on the James, sent Porter his answer at 9 p.m. The general commanding desires you to move your command at once. The artillery reserve moving first to Harrison's Bar. The 7 days were over. 7 days of smoke and noise and heat and bloodshed and wounds and groans and sufferings, mingled with loud huzzas and rejoicings, as one veteran described them. And now a sad silence settled momentarily over Malvern Hill, broken only by the pitiful cries of the wounded and the dying. I have never seen a battlefield, wrote an officer after the war, where there was such frightful mutilation of bodies as there was at Malvern Hill, owing to so much artillery having been used. Many were cut entirely in two. Some were headless, while fragments of bodies and limbs were strewn about in every direction. In the stark, somber woods and the filthy, stinking swamps, the surgeons were busily amputating the eerie glow of lanterns under the long black shadows. Today I was actually lucky enough to meet or run into a fellow YouTuber, and he gave me some very sound knowledge of the carnage and the emotions that ran through everybody. He said a brother was killed over here in this area along this tree line behind me, and his brother found him, sadly. And I can only imagine what it would have been like to see your brother be killed in battle. Actually, your blood brother killed in battle, because soldiers are brothers that are bonded over the same thing, and they have their own way of bonding, and that's a bond that cannot be broken. That's a respectable bond. That's but then when you see your brother who's been killed, that's got to be gruesome and sorrowful, because he even told me, and I agree, that these battlefields are nothing to be romanticized about or show glory. This is where death happens. This is where destruction happens. I know I've said that before, but they're not glorified for anything. These are hallowed grounds. These are sacred. These are where people lost their lives over a cause that they so justly believed in, and everything. And I can only imagine, as I was told, right behind me here along that tree line, the Confederates, they saw during the evening hours these cannons firing at them, creating all this smoke, and they knew that they were going into that. That's got to take a special kind of bravery, courage even, or maybe some craziness. I will never know. And it's because that the people who fought here today and died is the reason why I'm here. And that's why, that's some of the sound knowledge that my fellow YouTuber shared with me. And that's pretty much sums it all up. Malvern Hill, he says he likes it, and I greatly can agree with it. Malvern Hill was the Gettysburg of the South. There was so much carnage, so much destruction, so much death. And it's only going to get worse, because we haven't even gotten to Antietam yet. Antietam's in a couple months, and where even more gruesome carnage happens. And then we see Gettysburg, and then we see Spotsylvania Courthouse and Petersburg and Vicksburg and more carnage. But this is just the beginning. But with that, I hope you like this video. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.